Can everybody hear me? Yes. Wonderful. So it is my absolute pleasure to be here with you today, all you beautiful souls. If COVID has taught me anything, it's not to take these moments for granted. And maybe my appreciation is compounded by the fact that I've been reading Dr. Shahad's books and essays and poems over the past few days, and they have reawakened in me an appreciation for our embodied experiences in time. But more on that in a moment. Before I forget, I'd like to thank the creative and talented Erid Saleh and Public Frog Production, without whom this event would not have been produced, managed, hosted. So AJ Moschino was coordinating with me and Shahd while she was in the US. So totally appreciate you. Thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank CAP and specifically Ibrahim Farghali and the team for providing a safe space for this conversation that is near and dear to my heart. And of course, I thank you all for coming today. And I know it's still scorching hot. I don't know when the weather is going to change. And while I love this establishment, I know parking sometimes is a hassle. So thank you so much for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Faris. I'm a Kuwaiti writer and a certified coach for creatives. I've been teaching creative writing for the past 10 years all over Kuwait. And I have an Arab Woman Award for my impact. And as someone who teaches and coaches creatives, I've been facilitating creative writing workshops to help individuals enhance their creative writing skills, increase their self-awareness, and uncover their authentic desires. And you know, today we're going to be talking about the power of language, writing, and literature. So I thought, who better to have this conversation with than with Dr. Shahd Shammari, who I am positive needs no introduction, but for anybody here who is new to Dr. Shahad's work, here is a brief overview. Dr. Shahd is a Kuwaiti-Palestinian author and academic. She is an assistant professor of English literature at Gulf University for Science and Technology, and she has written extensively on gender and disability. She's also known as the literary mentor, offering classes and workshops for writing and wellness. And as a published author, she has written many books and essays. The latest is a magnificent memoir. Absolutely loved it, Wallah. Head Above Waters. It was first published in the UK by Neem Tree Press in 2022, and which has recently come out of the US from Feminist Press. Head Above Water was shortlisted for the Barbillion Prize for Literature, a British literary award dedicated to the furtherance of ill and disabled voices in writing. And in fact, we have 2 copies today, inshallah, not one. At the end of the event, Arij is going to announce the winners. She has already picked the names from the FOGA registration. So, let's begin. All right. How are you, Dictora?
My turn. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm really, really grateful to be here. And again, thank you to CAP. Thank you to Nada for, really preparing lots of really interesting questions. I'm happy to be doing this with a, long-time friend. It's always different when you do, academic talks. This is more heartfelt conversation. And I know at the end, I'd love to hear from you and maybe, stay around a bit just for a quick chat so we can get to know each other.
Beautiful. So, I obviously know you, as you just mentioned, we've been longtime friends. We first met at Kuwait University in the Department of English Language and Literature. This was nearly 20 years ago. And I remember we were both actively writing poems, plays, essays, and at the time you knew about your MS diagnosis. So you were dealing with physical pain, chronic physical pain. At the time I didn't know about my neurodivergence, but I was, experiencing the world through a neurodivergent filter that I later found out was bipolar type 2. And it's very interesting with these cases because when you're young, you're judging everybody around you, but you don't really know what they're going through. So what strikes me specifically about that period of our lives is that neither you nor I were reading literature that quote-unquote represented us. Right? And yet still literature saved our lives. So literature that nowadays that is actually called Orientalist, colonialist, misogynist, right? So I guess my question is, what was it that you were reading in college that awakened in you the desire to write your own works, and did the power differentials impact your reading at the time?
So I think there's a lot of English majors in the audience and people who studied English literature ages ago. At the time, it wasn't what I read, it was what I didn't read that really affected me. So if you go to university, you know that there's a certain set of texts that we read. We don't usually have much of a choice in what we're taught, and most of these works were very canonical. We did a lot of Shakespeare, we did a lot of poetry, we did a lot of the canonical texts, and most of them tended to be by male authors. They tended to be by white authors, and we stopped there. I didn't think that most of them were actually by able-bodied authors. I didn't even know the term back then. So college is a time where, like you said, you're judging everyone else, you're judging the works you're reading, you have a lot of strong feelings. And I was going through a life-changing diagnosis. MS as a term, just to kind of clarify for those who don't know, اللي هو التصلب المتعدد بالعربي. It really affects a lot of young people, and you're talking from the ages of 16, 17, 18, early 20s, hardly ever noticeable. So it is noticeable sometimes. You might see somebody with a wheelchair, sometimes you'll see me going up the stairs fine, sometimes I'll be playing squash, you wouldn't believe me, you'd say, she's making it all up. So it's an invisible disability. And because of that, I didn't understand what that really meant. So, I didn't have a sense of a support system. I didn't, tell my friends. I didn't tell my professors. I was very much isolated. And again, because I didn't have the language for that. As a lover of words, I found that words were disappointing. I found that, literature was constantly about certain people. And it was constantly about certain themes. So we were reading about, Beowulf, we were reading about a physical, strong hero, who manages to be successful. And I would reflect and think, gosh, I'm never going to be that, I'm not any Beowulf. And I wanted to be somewhat heroic. And again, put this into that context of being 18, 19, 20, you're trying to prove yourself, not just to others, but also to yourself. This is my life's journey. So the idea of a life journey, I found it represented in literature as one that is successful, one that is healthy, with no mental health difficulties, no physical difficulties. Most of the characters were, if anything, nearly perfect. And if they weren't perfect, they would solve their conflicts. They would, manage to be successful. They would be some sort of happily ever after. Fast forward a few years, I did my bachelor's at KU, where we had such a great experience with literature, and I see a lot of familiar faces here. It was a beautiful time, more than anything, because we were exposed not just to literature, but also to how we made sense of what we were reading. So we were asked to reflect, we were asked to think about what the text actually meant. So that's when I developed an interest in understanding how literature represented our lives. And I found that it did to a certain extent. When I went on to study graduate study, I focused on mental health and mental illness in literature. I was fascinated by the idea of madness. I was fascinated by this idea of, who are these mad protagonists, the dangerous ones, the ones that we, read about only to feel fear, the ones that we don't want to be like. And partly that was because I hadn't found enough physical representation of physical illness in literature. What I found was mental health was represented. Of course, not the way we would have liked to see it, but it started me on this journey of thinking about the mind and the body. and how those two were represented in the books that we read, the books that we loved. So it started with Jane Eyre. Now, I'm sure a lot of people have read it or have been forced to read it, in school. And that was the idea of the mad woman in the attic. That was the idea of somebody who was so mentally unwell that she had to be shunned and stigmatized. And I found myself in her. I found myself shunned by society, shunned by family. I found myself thinking about how, if I were to go to university with a cane, I would get a lot of questions. I would get comments sometimes. I still remember things like "مو حلو على البنات," إنك تمسكين cane. Things that were at the time just painful. But I didn't think about what that actually meant, that this wasn't just me. It was everybody who was living with neurodivergence or physical disabilities. That sense of stigma was always there.
So, Shahd, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying it's not the stories that changed, because it's the same stories that you read in graduate studies, right? It's the way that they were taught.
Yes.
So in Kuwait, if I'm hearing you correctly, in Kuwait University, you were not taught to read those texts in more personable manners, is that?
So we were taught to read literature, and we were taught to think about colonialism. We were taught to think about post-colonial literature, about gender. But disability and the body was left behind. And for many reasons, we actually, and it's not just KU, this is very recent stuff that now, disability has to be part of any literature department, disability studies. You need to talk about even math studies. So that has to be part of any English department, has to be part of the curriculum. We didn't have that. So after being exposed to these texts again, through, when you do graduate study, you're really, really pouring your heart and soul into it, but you're also looking for these intricacies, you're looking for these gaps, what's missing. As I was reading, I started to understand that the term that was missing was stigma, that the term that was missing from our conversation was dehumanization, the marginalization of these bodies that are, considered inferior or considered dangerous. So it started with me thinking about mental health, because there was a distance from that. I wasn't suffering from depression. I wasn't struggling with any sort of mental health issue, but I was really struggling with physical pain. And for me, this desire to search for meaning started with looking for where were the mad women protagonists in literature? What was their voice? It later moved on to thinking about the body. So again, as with anything very personal that we're struggling to look at, it was a journey. It began with looking at something I felt connected to, but a bit distant from. And then I started looking at the lack of the body's representation in literature.
Interesting. Anna, I think what I'm hearing you say in that some professors in university who are not teaching those books, because my experience had been totally different. With Pierre Smith, for example, Dr. Payne, even Steele, when you mentioned stigma, we already discussed stigma with, for example, Tess of the Derbyshires, right? And I'm also struck by your book, because you talk about those same stories. It's the same poems, novels, etc. that were taught at KU, but it seems like you're reading them with a different lens.
Absolutely, because our experience of literature differs. Your experience is definitely different. My experience was different based on the year, based on the semester, based on who teaches it. But also the themes that you were looking for might be different from the themes that I was looking for.
So I have this perfect question for you, because yes, we are on the same page. You have an article in Sikka magazine entitled "Why More of Us Should Study Literature," where you write, "For me, literature, especially fiction, is great because it serves a great purpose. It opens the mind to possibilities and realities we don't always relate to." You also write, quote, "But it is this unreal world that can actually provide us with a lens to examine ourselves and our environments. We need stories of others, those who are seemingly different but more alike than we think we are." And finally you add, "Readers of literature develop empathy. We develop a worldview and realize that we are not as lonely or as isolated from the world as we think. There is a common humanity that we disregard. literature is universal. And it is this universality that I attempt to show in my teaching. So we get a glimpse of that in your latest memoir, Head Above Water, which is absolutely stunning and full of those examples of how you can teach those same texts that nowadays are being discussed in super narrow-minded ways, right? Like copy-paste, everybody's copy-pasting the same theory about the same text. And yet, there's an entire section in your book, it struck me, it's so profound when you talk about, for example, how you teach Othello at the different universities, at the Arab Open University to a class of male students, and how you were discussing Othello in a way that became super personable to them. So can you talk to me about that when you say the universality of literature, and it's really about how you teach it as a professor that makes the difference?
So I think a big part of teaching for me and for many people who teach, or I hope it would be a big part, is also this emotional connection to the classroom. And not just an emotional connection, but also localizing the texts, bringing these texts closer to the current climate, to the current issues that are happening, in our case in Kuwait. So yes, I do have to teach canonical texts like Shakespeare, but that doesn't mean the conversation can't be guided or facilitated in a different way. So I do bring up issues of racism and how that applies. It's not just white and black, but for Kuwait it's very specific. And with Othello specifically, that was a really important text because it was affirming a lot of these students' identities. So we looked at how Othello could easily be identified as Bedouin, and how that would be belonging in society, but not really belonging, welcomed, but not really welcomed into society, having certain privileges, but also feeling insecure at many, many times. So I think a big part of it does have to do with who's teaching, but also who's reading. So this is really important. So I have some of my students here, and a lot of times they will be the ones who say, sorry, Dr. Shahd, but you didn't talk about the body, or you didn't talk about how this representation is actually really inaccurate and it's misogynistic. I'd be looking at the universal themes. I'm still trying to push this idea of universality because I feel we have moved away from this universality of literature. We're really hung up on these terms, which have been, proven to be quite helpful in theory, but we tend to also focus on that rather than try to find this emotional connection between the text and the reader.
Because the whole point of literature is you develop depth of perception. You understand that there is a theme and there's a metaphor and, character tropes, for example. In the book, you talk about, in that Arab Open University class, a class of only male students, what the major conversation you were having about Othello is not, is he a Moor, is he not a Moor, is Shakespeare racist, is not shit. No, you were talking about the act of honor killing.
Yes.
As men in a conservative environment, did Othello have a right to murder Desdemona? And some of the conversations in that class were like, yes, Dictora, because a Rayal is all about sharaf, right?
Yeah.
So, and I love that in that same article you talk about Shakespeare as being, Shakespeare is for everyone. It doesn't mean that you adopt Western values and you say these are our Western, you engage with literature as an academic, right?
Absolutely. So that's a great example actually, because again, when you think you're teaching something as canonical as Shakespeare, you don't think that there's going to be an argument that's actually quite local. And literature doesn't just represent life, but it also affects life. And I think we tend to forget that. It's not just representing life, but it's also affecting perception. So when you have that conversation with, a text that's so important, you will get a lot of resistance. And there has to be this patience to go through it. And I can't say it wasn't triggering, it wasn't upsetting. Of course, it was incredibly upsetting. But the goal was always to again, find ways that we can be affected by what we're reading. Not just look at it from, this critical perspective of what does this actually mean for others, but what does it actually mean for us? What does it mean here in Kuwait at this specific time? that was really scary.
Okay.
كمل ولا؟ So that's about it.
I think you already touched on this when I was asking you, like in university, what were you reading? I am trying to understand if you were attracted to texts because you knew about your disability and you were looking for characters that were, for example, disabled, or characters that were touching on the complexity of gender in Kuwait, or were you just following characters that were interesting to you without the actual labels? Shahd, I mean, just telling the world, one of the best plays, you did two really awesome plays in college, I still remember.
Which one?
My Last Duchess or Medea,
Yeah.
And both of them, you can see that the themes are consistent. Even the poetry that you were reading that you loved, the poetry that you started to write during English Day, the essays that you were writing, and what kind of subjects you were trying to tackle in your essays. But this was still a period where you didn't have those critical labels, gender studies and disability studies. So for younger students who are still in university, who are trying to figure out, okay, what's my vocation? I'm too young to figure out a career for my life, right?
Yeah.
What could they look to as signals or signs for you're on the right path, feeding your authentic curiosity, keep moving in this direction, and a vocation will blossom?
So I think the first thing is that it really changes, and we have to kind of allow that change to happen. So I essentially thought I would be like a dramatist. I would, create plays and films, and I really didn't think that I would be a writer or that I would be teaching. I wanted to do something that was more like a performance. And essentially that changed, and I couldn't be happier that it did change. And now I find myself in a different position. But what I would say is that you develop a connection to something in literature or something in poetry. So again, it started for me with drama, but then it moved into fiction, and now it's in nonfiction. It's in memoir writing and real lived experiences of health. So that was probably that I allowed myself these changes to take place. So I didn't resist them. And for me, I didn't understand that what I was attracted to, these characters that I was attracted to. Why was I attracted to Captain Ahab, for instance, in Moby Dick? Like, who likes him? I was obsessed with him. But why was I obsessed with him? So I didn't understand until I started thinking about Captain Ahab not as an evil character, not as just the villain. And a lot of times we tend to work with just one or two labels, and we don't think about what that could possibly mean. And we do this in our everyday life. She's great, he's great, good, bad, very simple, black and white thinking. It's just easier. But when I started studying more about madness in literature, I was sitting with my supervisor one day, and I had to tell her, hey, listen, I have MS. This was my first time to tell, somebody much older and an academic. And it's going to be very hard for me to continue to show up on time and to travel. I'm going to need some accommodation and so on. And then she looked at me and said, why don't you write about that? Why is that something you haven't shared? And it was a light bulb moment, because somebody actually asked me the question that I didn't dare to ask. And so I remember she pulled books from her library, and books that I had never seen before. So a lot of these books were memoir. A lot of these books were nonfiction by Black feminists, by Arab feminists, and they were writing about cancer. They were writing about illness. Virginia Woolf was writing about being ill, and all I knew was Virginia Woolf's Orlando. That's it, and Mrs. Dalloway. But those essays I had never come across. And again, it's no one's fault. I want to move away from, what people teach. It's because, in general, illness and disability is not something that tends to come up for us unless you're actually affected by it or a loved one is affected by it. And after COVID, we started thinking about health. We started thinking about the body. We started thinking about what does chronic mean in general? What does chronic illness mean? It changed how we thought about accessibility. It changed how we thought about depression. it was a huge shift for us academics, for us people in general. Society started actually asking, do you prefer a Zoom meeting or would you like to meet, in person? That was never a choice. Nobody would ever say, do you prefer a Zoom meeting? So again, illness is the last theme that literature touches upon. Love, tragedy, loss, those are the themes. And again, we don't think about them in our everyday life. It's the last thing we want to think about, unless you're affected by it, and that kind of interrupts our life, and it interrupts the journey. And for me, that interruption is probably why I ended up here.
Beautiful. And you do talk about the MS diagnosis and its aftermath in both your memoirs, Notes on the Flesh and Head Above Water. You write about a striking moment when doctors had to shut down your body and bring you back to life like a computer. I think this was like part of the STEM. Okay, but in both books you mention the importance of journaling.
Yes.
And in fact, one thing I really loved stylistically about Head Above Water is that the chapters begin with journal entries. So can you take us through the journaling phase of your writing journey, and like in what way was journaling helpful?
So, and I think that's probably the biggest takeaway from this whole talk, is that for me, it wasn't just literature that saved my life, but it was language. It was the ability to think about how I wanted to document experiences, how I wanted to document my life. With any kind of conflict that takes place in your life, and for me it was the diagnosis, there's a fear of losing everything. There's a fear of losing memory. There's a fear of losing identity. There's a fear of not being able to recall, what I said to you, how I said it to you, what happened, what were my major fears, what were my goals. So I started documenting and journaling almost on a daily basis. And I'm not going to lie and say these were profound journal entries. They weren't. They were as simple as, this sucks, this is horrible. I didn't have the language for it. I was just 18, 19. And so the language wasn't there. As I started, becoming, well-versed in literature and what I was reading at college, this grew into a blog. And this was a time where blogs were big. So I had this blog. And this blog was also very similar to the journal entries, but a bit different because it was on a public website, and anybody who typed in the name of the blog would be able to read about my daily life and what I was going through. This was a reflective blog. So this was a bit better than the journal entries because I was writing with also thinking about what I was writing and how I wanted people to reflect on similar themes. Not everybody was living with MS, so who cares? But everybody was living with loss in one way or another. So I started thinking about, how am I going to document this on this blog, or how am I going to post a post? And when I did, I started getting a lot of readers internationally, worldwide, locally. I was meeting people of different age groups. They would just, leave a comment, or they would, drop me a line. And I started thinking, okay, I think I have something. People are actually engaging with this. So the blog entries continued for about a decade. Still there, but I've stopped blogging for a while. But the blog entries were a big part of the desire to write Head Above Water. These entries were there. The journals were there. I had tons of notebooks filled with entries, years worth of stuff. And I thought, okay, since I'm a scholar and I'm working on nonfiction, I'm working on disability studies, why don't I put all of this into some kind of coherent structure, but also reflecting on how life is messy and how you go back and forth between, different parts of your life. So journaling definitely did me a huge favor. I think that if I didn't have these journals, I would have been essentially very depressed. Not to say that I wasn't, but it helped me make sense of the madness. It helped me make sense of loss. And many times when you lose your voice, whether through, a medical situation or maybe with parents or with society, you really want a sense of being heard. You want to reclaim your voice. So I would go to the doctor, not be heard, and write a different conversation. What should I have said? how could it have went? You didn't listen to me, but what I meant to say was, and again, this really helped me stay sane, I would say.
Anna, as someone who suffers from bipolar without knowing it, the journals for me became the only like stable item in an unstable home. Where you document, document like a sense of reality that isn't taken away by the parent who decides that no, this didn't happen. Dictora, in an article for the bookseller titled "Who is the Audience?" you write, as a disabled writer, I am primarily preoccupied with how disability features in literature and media. I am a scholar of disability studies too, with an interest in how the subject has primarily been Eurocentric. My work attempts to rectify the many gaps in literature about disability and by disabled authors. To date, there are hardly any works dealing with disability in Arab and or Muslim women. You also talk about how Notes on the Flesh was rejected by hundreds of publishers in North America and Europe on the basis of the following questions the publishers kept asking. How is this Arab woman's experience? We would like to see more Arabness and specificity. Disability is important, but we would like more about the love lives of Arab women. And can you expand the narrative? Who is the intended audience? Only disabled people? So, Dictora, at what point does representation in literature become a helpful requirement? Because we were saying, when we were reading literature, we were looking for people that represented us or talked about their stories. So, at what point does representation in literature become a helpful requirement? And when, if ever, does it become harmful?
So yeah, of course, it's very difficult for anybody who's writing as an Arab, woman, man, anybody who's writing as an Arab writing in English. It's a whole different story. There's always this idea of, are you representing the region? Are you representing what it means to be Arab, what it means to be woman? These were the constant questions. Yes, we understand the importance of talking about the body, but can you tell us about the feminine body, the sexualization of the body? We want to see more of that because that sells way better than what I was working with. So the constant rejections meant that representation wasn't really happening the way I was hoping it was. And I'm not white, as simple as that. And I don't come from that kind of background. I don't have these connections. So that was always coming up as we want to have the story, but in a different way. So that meant also trying to stay authentic and trying to stay connected to what was the goal behind the narrative. Who was the audience I was writing for? And it was very difficult because this was a conversation that had no answer. Yes, there was going to be a representation of illness, but I was supposed to represent it in a different way, not in an authentic way. Although this was a memoir, this was nonfiction. But again, also thinking about the publishing industry, what sells, what works. You have to look into the business side of things, into the market side of things. I was lucky enough eventually to find publishers who were thinking about intersectionality, they were thinking about feminism, they were thinking about representation in a different way. So they were thinking about an audience that maybe would be way less interested, an audience that maybe would pick up like 500 copies of the book. It wouldn't be a bestseller, but at least that they would have that on their bookshelves. It was their mission to make sure that these voices were also being heard.
That's really beautiful. Then right now in the publishing industry, there is a problem, and it's in the same way that we're talking about how there's a problem in the way people are reading literature. They're calling it critical theory, but really it's just copy-paste. So suddenly everything you talk about Kuwait has to be a copy-paste of some uniform Agrabah nation, like not even an Arab nation.
Yeah.
And the same thing is happening with writers who want to get published, but are actually, they can't because they're being told, well, you're not Arab enough, you're not feminine enough. And so they have to put on a clown costume called ethnicity, but it's the farthest thing from authenticity as possible, right? But Dictora, you just talked about journaling and blogging as two different, let's say, modalities of writing. And you just talked about representation, like having now to navigate a publishing world. You can't get published unless a publisher says, yes, I will take on this project. So can you just talk a little about the three different types of writing and maybe some of the benefits or challenges in journaling, blogging, and publishing?
Yeah. So journaling, of course, it's being personal. It's messy. It doesn't have to have an audience. You don't want it to have an audience. So it's as censored and it's as raw as it gets. The blogging, I took a step forward into the public world. And that was a huge step, to actually say, I'm going to write about, my body, I'm going to write about illness, and people were reading this. It was a complete conflict. It was very, very difficult. But I didn't just jump into the publishing world. It was definitely a journey. I started with a bit of poetry, actually, because poetry also provided me the sense of safety. There was a sense of, I could use metaphors, I could use figurative language. So it really kept me safe. And then I moved into short stories, fiction, and then finally into what I was really hoping to write, which was the memoir. Now, the difference was I had to also construct the memoir with fiction techniques. So I had to think about characterization, I had to think about themes, I had to think about pacing the narrative. I didn't want it to be boring, I didn't want it to just be raw. So again, that's a question I keep getting, especially for people who are interested in life writing and memoir writing. How much of it needs to be polished? All of it needs to be polished. It really needs to be polished, and you need to think about, is this a good book to read? Is this going to be interesting to anyone other than myself?
It is, it really is. Get the book.
Thank you. Again, it's hard because when you move from you're moving from journaling and you're moving from blogging, you're moving from a very absorbed almost idea. I want to think about me. But with memoir writing, I'm also writing for others. I'm writing for, my friends. I'm writing for my students. I'm writing for people who actually have never seen this represented anywhere. I'm writing for 18-year-old me who thought, the word MS was A. At this stage now, when I look at, pick up Head Above Water, I know it's not about me. I know that this started out with journaling. I know it started out with something very raw, but I polished it enough. It's been edited roughly, of course, by the publisher, and it's a very vulnerable and difficult journey because you need to think about the potential audience. What is this book really doing?
And how did your audience receive it? Like your community, because you were writing for a community, so you weren't writing for a racist audience that just wants Arab women to perform their disability level.
Or for the Nobel Prize.
But so then how did they receive it?
So I've been very blessed. I've met a lot of people. Again, that's part of the beauty of publishing something. You meet a lot of people. So I've met lots of people with different disabilities, invisible, physical, mental, all sorts of difficulties in life. And a lot of them have been saying the same thing, thank you for writing this. This is a narrative that is not about the evil side of disability. This is not a Captain Ahab character. This is not about the also inspirational character that could be disabled. All of these tropes are not there. So I've been receiving a lot of great feedback, and everybody keeps saying, I want to write my life story too. And that for me is the whole point of my whole life's mission. And I want to see these stories come to life. I want to see a different narrative, not the Beowulf narrative.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with the Beowulf narrative. Of course. But I have two more questions, and then we'll be done with me. In Head Above Water, you write, I began to fall in love with language, cling to it, and trying to find a place in it. Language was a place I could create a new identity for myself, someone I could fashion the way I wanted. But because I was attending an American school, English became the language that I reverted to. It was a language that could provide me with a sense of distance, and I would remain an outsider to English. It wasn't my first language, it wasn't my native language, it wasn't my mother's language. So today there are still students who think that English is the language of Kuwait's colonizer, and there are others who just feel ashamed that they learned English instead of Arabic. What would you tell them as a professor of English literature, as someone who reads primarily and writes primarily in English? What would you tell these students?
I think there's still a lot of stigma, and we get it even as authors. And why is the book not in Arabic? Or why you're not speaking in Arabic? I've had this numerous times in different events, and it's a complete also conflict of, who am I? What am I speaking? What feels comfortable to me? Eventually, I've come to this conclusion. I've made peace with it that English is also mine. It doesn't have to be the language of the colonizer only. Again, this black and white thinking. I moved past it and hoping to see more of us move past it. We're still so stuck on who's speaking English, why are you speaking English. There is a sense of shame that comes with it too, and I think it's very cultural, very much society that's still trying to push this group aside. There are people who still say this group does not exist. There are no readers who prefer to read in English, but quite there's all of us, we're all here. So it's invisible. Again, hopefully we get to a state where we accept that it's part of, like you say, it's Anglo-Haiti, and there's a side of we do have this, readership. It is there, and a lot of us feel at home in English.
I've always been admiring of you of the way that you brought activism into the classroom as an academic. One of the reasons I never took this route is because I was always fearful of the restrictions in the classroom. So for the past 10 years, I was teaching creative writing in like cafes and malls, and when I was invited into classrooms, even like by you, to speak to your students, I always had more freedom than the teacher who invited me. And so nowadays I see that you're kind of doing this work too, venturing into the cultural field and even having a brand name and a logo. So are you transitioning out of academia? Is this something that you are supplementing? So,
yeah,
because like you're known for talking about activism in academia, right? So I just want to know like where you are in your journey and what does the cultural field bring to the conversation?
So I think I've been very blessed that I've had about 10 years now in academia. I hope to stay in academia, just to be clear. I do hope to stay in the field, and it's who I am. I'm a teacher at heart. But I've also been blessed with such great connections and with such great students, and they've always called me our mentor. Yeah, they're the ones who gave me the logo. It's not me. They're the ones who said, Dr. Shahd, you've been our mentor, through depression, through illness, through different phases of our life-changing decisions. But I've done it through literature. I've done it through poetry. I've done it through us reading texts together and seeing how they affect us, what changes in us. So now I'm trying to work with an older group. I'm trying to work with different age groups, using the same kind of techniques, using literature for people who didn't study literature or for people who studied literature ages ago and they want to return to literature. And I use, very, very similar techniques. It's still a classroom setting, but it's just like a 2-hour thing. You get that dose of literature and we connect. It's also about making sure that I'm not stuck only in the classroom, where it's for a certain segment of society, for people who are privileged enough to be in that classroom. There's a lot of people who I feel need literature as much as I did.
Beautiful. I end all of my coaching, this is not a coaching session, but I end all of my coaching sessions by asking my clients, is there something that you'd like to say that you feel we haven't touched on already?
I think if you're interested in literature, please join me. My whole mission now is to take this outside of the classroom. So we do have a book club. I call it a reading circle, not a book club. And the idea of a reading circle is because it's a circle. It's about a safe space. It's about a sense of community. And I think that's what we really need, especially in Kuwait. And we need the sense of a reading circle, a writing circle. You can always join us. It's not a commitment where you have to read the book every 2 weeks, and if you don't feel like it, it's fine. You don't have to. Join the poetry, join the creative writing, get in touch. I'm, very accessible in different ways. I'm always on social media, and I always respond to messages. So, thank you.
You're super kind on social media. All right, I'd love to open the floor for questions. RH, you're gonna have to help us because we can't see anything.
That's okay. So I think we're gonna take questions. I think you just gotta be a little bit loud enough if you'd like question.
Marshall, just can you
Yeah.
let that
Does
in?
anybody have any questions for Dr. Shahd or Nada? Yeah.
Well,
What's your name?
Salman,
Come on.
thank you. I have two comments. You talked about mental health and literature. So I remembered an incident. We took a short story and then the professor told us how to analyze it.
Mm.
So it was the necklace and we have to use Freud. So it was for me as a person, it was problematic. I mean, the story itself was kind of shadow writing for the character for me. But I have to do it.
Yeah, you do.
So that incident, I mean, I got a great grade for it just because I followed the instructor, but I wasn't kind of okay with it. Yeah.
Can you explain, like, what was it that was problematic, or that where did you find the resistance in this
I mean,
analysis?
the theory itself about how human they are not able to change. This was the theory, I think, and how the character or the female character was, although she changed, but at the end, we see it, she wasn't. The whole incident wasn't changeable for her, just because she was that kind of person. So.
So what's the question?
In literature, we kind of we use some of the theories that are not. I think it's aged sometimes. Yeah, and some of the professors are kind of hard to kind of even discuss with. Yeah.
كلهم ربعي.
Can I ask you a question? Were you being asked to write the right analysis?
Yes.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay, so then we go back to the question we were talking about earlier. One of the things I love about literature is, like I said, it helps you think, it helps you process, it helps you relate, right? But if teachers are only expect students to copy paste answers, nobody learns. Nobody discovers what their authentic desires are, what the challenges in their lives are. So thank you, Simon, for talking about this, because like this is it. This is my issue with academia right now.
بس still ما فهمت السؤال. Are you asking me why did the professor do that, or what should you have done? Now I'm confused.
No, I mean, why? Yes.
Why do they do that?
Yes.
So I can't speak on all their behalf, sadly. And different people have different styles. So, and you figure that out as you go to, different classes. And, a lot of students here will tell you my style might be a bit different from other professors, but I will focus also on having the right terminology, that you understand the theory, you understand how to put your thoughts together. I do have also reader response, where I actually ask you, what do you think? And you must use I, and you must also reflect on it personally, what it means to you. فيعني كل بروفيسور عنده طريقته But I'm glad you reflected on it too. And like Neda said, ask yourself, why did you have such resistance to it? And the whole point of literature is to make you think about, why did that bother me so much? يعني إحنا عندنا وايد طلبة يقولون I hated the novel. That's not good enough. Why? What do you hate? Is it something that reminds you of your parent, of your mom, of your dad, of yourself? Again, it gives you that emotion. So that's what we want to get to. ليش؟ لأن we want you to transform as a person. The whole point is you. By we, I mean me.
Yeah, I was just gonna say you. Because the whole point of academic settings right now is I need you to tell me what I have in my head, which is not the same as literature, language, writing. These are things that are very personal. These are skills that students need to think about, like this resource of the self, right?
Yeah.
If you have them, you can think outside the box. You can make decisions that are courageous and brave, but still authentic. You can think about nuances and like, I want to please me, but at the same time, I want to please my community. So I can literally think in a spectrum.
Does anybody else have any questions? What's your name?
Sarah, thank you for the talk that you had, and So I recently read, like, I think it's a long essay by Roxane Gay. It's called Writing to the Wound. And she talks about trauma writing or memoir writing about trauma. She talks about sort of, she talks about a course that she taught, which is trauma writing. And like the very deliberate act of like writing with an audience in mind. So we touched on sort of journaling and the difference between journaling and then writing for the public, so blogging and then publishing. But these are all like, whilst not necessarily trauma writing, it is like you are dealing with very heavy topics like the body and illness, and like these are like, I mean, for you especially, they're extremely personal and like extremely personal experiences that you went through that I guess it's like you're being on, put on the spotlight when you're making yourself intentionally vulnerable when you write. So in a way, I guess they are kind of, writing about trauma. So how do you maintain sort of this lightness or talk about these heavy subjects while also not trauma dumping on the reader or with the reader in mind so that it remains light and hopeful, but also incredibly personal and dealing with these heavy topics?
Thank you so much, Sarah. As always, so insightful. تخليني أفكر لأن it's a really, really deep question. So that was also one of the things I really thought about because I've read a lot of heavy stuff too. Not just I've been through it, but I've read a lot of illness narratives. I've read a lot of these difficult topics. I didn't want the book to be, not just tragic. I didn't want it to be just tragic, and I didn't want it to be inspirational. Again, the black and white thinking. It's very hard to find that balance. And so even as I was writing, I would pause if I felt like, okay, this is too much at this point. And I would return to it later. And then I would think about, okay, how can I balance it out now with a bit of like a dose of things are going to be okay. It was really about finding that balance. I will tell you, as I was writing the book, I was going to therapy. I was, telling my therapist, this is what I wrote. It was pretty heavy. Can we process? Can we reflect? And how can we also rephrase certain parts? And again, because I'm a natural communicator, I'm a natural storyteller, I tell stories all the time, I was always thinking about what it sounds like too. Not just, I want to say it وخلاص بس يعني. What does it sound like to a reader who, like you said, it might be effectively, really traumatized by it or really, made to feel incredibly sad. I was really careful to think about the book, again, even the title, it's about keeping your head above water. مع إن ترى يعني the book feels like you're drowning a lot of times. But I wanted the title to also really emphasize this idea of survival more than anything. This idea of, I'm still here, we're still here, and life is difficult, traumatic, complex, complicated, but there has to be this sense of wellness. If there's illness, there has to be wellness. If there's darkness, there has to be lightness. I'm all for this kind of duality of thinking in my personal life and in the writing.
In your book, I noticed that you use a formal technique, which is the arc, affective arc. So the first part of the book is more inward facing, and here you are detailing the trauma. The reader is sucked in and gets to live with you all of the experiences. And then there is almost like an arc that suddenly tips into a more public facing narrative where you're talking now about the school and how you teach and the books that you read and how that is important. Another technique that you used to interrupt the trauma is the conversation with the students. Right?
Yeah, and that I think was really important. Everybody keeps asking me why Yasmin. It's not Yasmin as a character, but Yasmin represents all of these wonderful voices that I've connected with. She represents that voice that probes you, that asks you, that questions you. Sometimes it's your inner voice. And we've had lots of interesting conversations that make me think, why didn't I think of that? And for me, connection is what keeps us alive. Connection is what keeps us here. It's kept me here. And if it weren't for, connections with students, with friends, with family, with readers, people, halfway across the world, I don't think that I would have kept my head above water. Simply, I wouldn't have. And the book moves from internal to external because I personally have moved from internal to external. all my work now is about reaching out rather than just focusing on Shahd. I want to focus on what it means to reach out to the other, whoever that other is.
Yeah, no, it's also really great. Yani, I have a book of short stories, Mr. Diary, where I rewrite my trauma. So the trauma doesn't exist on the page. I use humor as a technique to convey some stories about like the family dynamic without ever naming anything. And for me, it was the only way to communicate what was going on. But reading your book, I don't think I'm at a phase right now where I'm brave enough to use the terminology to talk about what actually is going on.
We actually sometimes refer to it as heart work.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of heart work involved in it, and again, it's not about navel gazing. It's not about me, and that's the stigma that's associated with memoir writing or writing narrative nonfiction. You want to write not just for yourself, for your own healing, but your own trauma. But you're also externalizing this conversation. Everybody who picks up the book will have a completely different experience, and they're teaching me something too.
Good. Other questions?
Yeah, we need one more question, if anybody has one.
Doctor.
I'm interested in learning more about or knowing more about what both of you think of the activism and advocacy for bringing the type of teaching and the courage into the classroom through literature. I mean, we know what the research shows about teaching and learning, and unfortunately, it's just not getting into every single classroom. I'm talking K-16, and coming from an educator lens. However, Salman brought up a really good point about if you're sort of pushed, yes, on your own you can reflect on why that pushed me, but wouldn't that be a great conversation with the professor or with the teacher? So as a community, how can we kind of push that narrative further and faster?
It's a really great question, and I know your education background and your background with pedagogy. It's a great question to think about. I think most of us are still stuck with a very rigid mindset. I get very lucky sometimes if I have a classroom with 10 people. It's usually up to 40 in a classroom. So it's very hard to develop these connections, and it's hard to have this safe space. When I do have 10 who sit in a circle, I get to know them, they get to know each other. It changes the dynamic completely. So I think we definitely need to think about also the logistics of it and making sure that we can have at least one of these classes where we can push against the idea of the lecture, the idea of the classroom being just led by this individual and the superiority that comes with it. A lot of feminist politics will say the way to do it is for us to be a bit more on an equal standing and listen rather than speak. Again, it's a sad truth that we're in a very difficult place still. We get to do it sometimes, but hardly ever.
I'm not an educator in the sense that I didn't do the work inside a classroom consistently. But I was invited into classrooms, right? And for the past 10 years, I was doing something with writing that I didn't even know what it was called. Only in 2022, I became certified as a coach, and now I have the actual terminology that, oh my God, all this time I was using language and writing and literature to coach individuals to become more independent, authentic, tap into their agency, reflect on their wounds and stuff. So at least now I have a label for the work that I was doing before. But I'll give you an example. I had a friend who became a teacher at a public high school. You know her. She was with us at university. And she invited me once. She was like, Nada, I have a class of high school students, girls, Batahia. And she's like, I want you to come. I want them to experience you, but at the same time, I know that the administration doesn't really want anything that's outside of the books, right? So I told her, I got you. Sorry, I hit the mic. I was like, I got you. Don't worry. That's what I do. That's like, give me the restrictions, and I'll find a way to speak to students authentically in spite of the restrictions. So she was like, yeah, trust me. We're gonna have 2 supervisors inside the classroom to make sure that you don't do anything like, untoward. And you're going to have to submit all of your material before. They have to accept it. They're not gonna accept anything that's outside of the box. So I was like, okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give your students a 2-day essay writing workshop. And I am going to bring the 2 most boring writing prompts. Why smoking is bad, and what did you do on your summer vacation? And she was like, that's not what I'm asking you to. I'm like, just trust me, then trust me. We need to get this visit approved by the administration. So we got it approved. I submitted all of my documents. This is the 5-part essay that we're going to teach. These are the writing grammatical tools that we're going to introduce in the class. Everything was approved. So I came in, introduced myself, asked the students to tell me like who they were and why they were in this class. Most of them were not interested. And then I did this. This was back when there was a blackboard. I went to the blackboard and I wrote the word freedom in capital letters. You had to see the poor supervisors in the back freaking out. I was like, just calm down. Freedom. And I asked the students, what does this word mean to you? And then all of a sudden, Miss, freedom is bad. Why? Because the West want us to ruin our Islam. Okay, what else? Freedom is bad. Why? Because they want children to disobey their parents. Okay, what else? We went around the class. Freedom is bad, 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 bad. I said, hello. I went to the blackboard. I erased the word freedom, and I wrote al-hurriya. And then all of a sudden, there was silence for a few seconds. And I'm like, yalla. What does this word mean to you? La la la, al-hurriya is good. Oh, why is it good? أصلاً الإسلام هو اللي جاب الحرية. Okay, what else? هو حرية إذا أنت تطيعين your parents. They were telling me like if you obey your parents, that's actually freedom. But they were using the word in Arabic. It is the same word. In English, it brought up all of this baggage that they had, and then in Arabic, it was all of these benefits. So I told them, okay, did you see what happened? This is the materiality of language. We're going to turn now to the normal essay. We're going to talk about smoking, and we're going to talk about your summer vacation. But I want you to be mindful of that. What does this word really mean? What is it hiding? How are you relating to it personally? And the best question of all is, do you want to change that? This essay is your opportunity to explore the possibility for a different thought process.
I think everybody will stay with the idea.
Yeah, please.
Anything else?
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you guys. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr.